Okay, I'm gonna go and get started on this. As of now, the first part of this intro, like the part of this series, is not going to be up. I recorded it already. It will be up before this video is up. But in the intro, I discussed starting out with the intros of Pan-African socialism. I discussed mainly a breakdown of these like how controlled how like people fall into these different categories of ideologies, and I basically explained them and explain some of the like pitfalls, like in a general sense. And I mentioned in that video that in this one I'm going to go over the contradictions that exist with movement building in general. And this, like I said, the series is going to be Pan-Africanism and socialism. That's mainly going to be the type of ideas that I discuss. But obviously these, for example, could apply to anything. Obviously the ideologies could apply to anything. And then even when I go into my next videos, when I start and do like a breakdown of the ideas of people like, I think I'm probably going to do, as I mentioned, Adolph Reed. I mentioned Gerald Horne. Adding to that, I'm definitely now, I know if you watch the first video, I'll mention that I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but I'm definitely going to do, what's his name? Frank Wilderson. What is he? Afro-pessimist. I'm going to break down the Afro-pessimist angle too. I watched the video where interview he did, and it was interesting. Some of the points he brought up, some of the things that he had discussed as far as, where he feels his views aren't going wrong or are going right, and questions that he raises as far as an analysis, as far as his framework, as far as his ideology. I could address those. So I'm definitely going to do a breakdown of that. So in this video, I'm going to go ahead and discuss these. But first, what I want to do is go over some like background stuff. Now, this might be broken down. I mentioned this in the first video. This might be broken down into another one. Or usually what I'm probably going to do with this series is I'm probably going to post the full recordings, edit it a little bit, edit out errors and stuff like that, edit in videos and stuff like that if I need to, images. But then I'm probably going to break them down if there's like something goes too tangent and I want to stick to like a specific script for each video. I'm probably going to just break them down afterwards. And then obviously I might break them down as far as like where I'll give you like the points of each location, depending on where I discuss what. But I do want to discuss this now. I'm going to go ahead and first I'm going to open up the browser. And I'm going to give background. Basically what I'm going to do is there are ideas centered around the concept of alienation in Marx. And that comes from Hegel. So I want to discuss, I'm not really going to go over Hegel like in detail. I'm just going to go like basically point to where it comes from, just so people have the idea that this is where it comes from, these ideas. And then I'm going to move on to discuss the discussion of Marx and how he develops these ideas into his critique of capitalism and like what ends up becoming like Marxist historical materialist ideologies. And then I'm going to get into then how the Pan-Africanists develop certain angles around shifting from the proletariat and Marx, for example, to Du Bois shifting to, obviously, Pan-African perspective, a proletarian through, slavery and, black experience. And then obviously the colonial experience that Fanon brings to the table and how that centers a different aspect and how that has different implications on revolutionary potential, which are obviously applied to when I go down my list of, revolutionary potential and how capitalism evolved and how they were able to utilize Marx's ideas and kind of bring a different paradigm possibly to the original structure, which is still originated back in Hegel. But, so if we go back to Hegel, now this is definitely, it's not going to be big enough, so I'm going to have to blow it up here. Okay. Like 500, so that should be good. Okay, so this is the phenomenology of spirit. I think this is the table of contents. Sometimes on the Marxist website they break it down like 5 different tables of contents where they got, it'll expand it and list like everything. But let me see this one. Okay, so yeah, so this is from the phenomenology, and one thing that probably most people who are familiar know, I mean, with like any Marx or any, this like tradition, either in philosophy or in, I mean, like movements or in Marxism or, whatever else, like just the academy, generally other, areas, will know of like the significance. And this is a pretty big, I mean, I don't know how many people by now have used this this specific part of the phenomenology on lordship and bondage. And always the master slave dialectic is how it always gets like like when it's brought up, that's how it always gets described. But like I said, I don't want to really go over this, but I'm just pointing back to it. But the concepts of a duplicated self-consciousness comes up a lot. And thought, like that I'm going to discuss when you look at Du Bois's work and when you look at Fanon, this gets, I mean, they keep going back to this. And obviously people apply this to Marx's concept of the proletariat as against capital, right? Because of the discussion here of the lordship and bondage, what people call bondsman, master slave, is what people, but lordship and bondage is more accurate. You want to keep that more accurate to what would be the social dynamics that existed during Hegel's time. So you can always keep in mind that when you're applying it, that his existence, his experiences are not going to be the same as yours. So when you're applying, you have to keep like kind of keep in mind and keep everybody else informed on the fact that you're utilizing it and applying it potentially maybe differently. Not necessarily because he was wrong, not just because there was limitations in his theory, but just because there's now different circumstances which it is applying to, right? So, in this he talks about, okay, experience of life and stuff like that. And what I want to what I want to emphasize here, when Hegel is talking about this type of stuff, he's talking about it philosophically, in terms of phenomenology specifically. But it has the double meaning, and it has multiple meanings. So there's multiple meanings and layers of significance to what Hegel is saying. But primarily, that's just like kind of an effect of his language and of his artistry and how he brought forth his ideas. It's not necessarily inherently what he's actually like the philosophy of it, right? The ideas that he's trying to present don't necessarily have that significance in and of themselves as philosophy. So this stands basically as like conceptual frameworks for how humans understand and experience the world, like subjectively, not like actual situations. So when he's talking about this, and people say master slave dialectic, and they talk about physical relationships between a master and slave in terms of how they appropriate it, and this is what I meant by the emphasis on this. When they appropriate it, which is proper, and it should be done, and that Hegel would have been cool with that, because that's the whole point of taking philosophy and then applying it to science, applying it to experiential, which when he moves on, that's kind of like the whole point of his work, right? He's explaining how the logic applies at different levels of knowledge, right? So he's perfectly okay with this, but you have to, like, when you apply it to political economy like Marx does, you have to be clear that you're taking something that Hegel was applying. And Marx is not very clear about this, and this is one of the problems with Marx, because when he does it, he spends all of these years pretending that Hegel is kind of like has this split that doesn't exist between materialism and idealism, when Hegel is very clear. And I discussed this in my videos on Marx. If you want to go back, and I discuss how Hegel defines idealism and how he doesn't see the split, right? So basically he defines in terms of the ideal, the finite being ideal, and he explicitly says in terms of real philosophers are idealists, and there is no inherent split between also accepting idealism. There is no inherent split between real and ideal in that sense. It's just they're just non-concepts basically. They don't really apply, but broken down into their various moments like Hegel does throughout his philosophy, right? So in that sense, when Marx tries to come and say that he's opposing a materialism, and in his work, obviously I discussed this, he's opposing it to specifically to like when he does his refutations and his polemical work and early on, it's geared towards or against the young Hegelian like kind of philosophers who were all materialists themselves. So it's a materialism as against a materialism, and then he was using his interpretation based on that materialism, and his understanding that he had of Hegel through basically his interpretation or misinterpretation or misunderstanding, but basing it. He studied under Bruno Bauer, and obviously the works of these people are coming out. So he's influenced by that. He's under that context, and through his misinterpretations of Hegel, he throws these shots at Hegel, as he mentions later in his work, where the flipping it on the head, and how back in my day, basically he says Hegel fell out of favor over time, and I threw my shots back in the day at Hegel. But now I'm trying to avenge as my thing. He's the one that basically come with basically he's not fully admitting there that he made the error that I just described of him misinterpreting Hegel and not seeing the significance of it, right? And that's why he used like the mystical shell and stuff like that. When in reality, he was just being he wasn't being very careful, and he wasn't trying to be very proper in his approach to his method as he should have been and as he was when he started doing Capital. But obviously he ended up correcting somewhat, and he did a very good job at Capital using Hegel's work as it should have been. And it's kind of funny because at one point he made fun of people for using all this Hegelian language, and he incorporates it into his work. He made fun of them for using Hegelian ideas and stuff like that, and then he ends up doing it, and he makes fun of them for this focus around ideas, and then he ends up doing basically a critique of ideology and ideas. But obviously the thing to be said about that is philosophy deals with how human beings come into understanding and relate and understand the world. So inherently you're dealing with ideas, right? And then when you switch from first philosophy to the natural philosophies to actual what we call today like science, like the natural sciences, physical sciences, right? You're obviously switching from your subject matter being thought to your subject matter being physical world. And obviously you're going to make that change from what is inherently dealing with ideas to what is inherently dealing with the material world. But that's just obvious. That's not like a philosophical error. And it's a philosophical error as Marx did to try to like say, well, this is idealism. And then this, no, you just, what is dealing with philosophy is dealing with philosophy. And then what is dealing with the physical material world is dealing with the material world. And that's what needs to be cleared up here with Lordship. It has that significance, and it has the beauty of having that significance. Like how it can have just so many different significances, and it can apply in that way, and as people do apply it. But and like I show when they apply it with psychoanalysis and psychology, like the Bois and Fanon, it's wonderful. But the language often gets people confused because I see a lot of people going back to this work and then trying to pretend like Hegel is saying, making some assessment of the material world when he's really not. It just has that double significance. Like it has those layers to it. And basically what he's trying to describe is, human beings' experience. But he's not talking about the specific particular experience. He's talking about in thinking and relating to the world and developing their ideologies and their thought processes. Not like subjective experience in terms of psychological like when you talk about like encountering somebody, or you're talking about being a slave, how that psychology works with regard to like the relationship, the social relation and stuff like that. So moving on, the concept that kind of gets pulled out of this is alienation. That's the primary one that from Marx and then like Fanon and people like that, what they're pulling out is alienation or estrangement, self-estrangement. And then here he's put the matter otherwise, self-consciousness is only something definite. It only has real existence so far as it alienates itself from itself. So yeah, alienation. And when he's talking about alienation or estrangement, it's dividing up of like the thought, for example. So if you think dividing yourself up from the world or dividing your theory up from reality in terms of your understanding, right? So you'll have like a theory or you have like a scientific theory, for example. This is the easiest way I know how to describe it. In terms of thought, is think of a scientific theory versus like the scientific theory in terms of hypothesis, in terms of like the actual theory in relation to proving the theory with experiments, and observation, and then like the experiments to prove your theory correct, like the predictions basically. And that's what a kind of example. But then obviously there's tons of more, but that's just one that's very easy to understand. And I don't think I need to go over this yet. So this should be good. All right, never mind. But anyway, I can move on anyway. I think I explained that well enough. So let me go ahead and bring up this so I could kind of chart what I want to talk about. So when Marx applies it to capital, you have to understand. Think of it first as just production, right? How human beings produce. And if you go back, if you think of like the philosophically, here's where Marx is coming from, right? Because you have to think of how human beings, like when we talk about value and a production of value, you have to think about how human beings create things that they utilize or that for themselves to survive or sustain themselves. And if you have to think, if you think of it not even abstractly, but if you think of like a person and say they need food, well, it's their interaction with the world that gets in that. If they want to build something, it's their interaction with the world, i.e., it's their labor that is creating the value and the wealth, right? And we call that labor within, political economics, like the production. You have to produce it. You have to produce the wealth, and you produce the wealth through labor. Ignoring money, ignoring anything added in yet. If you just need to produce wealth, you want to build houses, you want to, build roads, you want to collect food, you want to cultivate the land to farm, to eat, to domesticate animals, or you just want to, hunt and gather, you have to produce through labor. And that's why labor becomes the basis of the value and of the wealth. So if you just have production here and you split into capital and labor, you can view this as a form of alienation between capital and labor. Because when you're just in production, generally, capital and labor can be seen as together. So if there's ever a split, there has to be a split first that happens within production of wealth for there to be this alienation or estrangement between these two to then generate a particular social relation off of that. Now, see how Hegel thinks of these, like if you think of these at a first philosophical level, right? some people like to use the term metaphysics. That's kind of a misnomer, sort of. But if you think of it at a metaphysical level, if that's what if that's the word you're comfortable or familiar with, you have to think of it in terms of ideas as they relate to each other, as we're able to understand the world, right? So, what is our idea of production? What is our idea of labor? What is our idea of wealth? And how do we understand these in terms of relations to other things and processes, right? So to understand, production of wealth, you have to understand, the concept of labor. You have to understand the concept of, in accordance with the action of, producing and, work or, building or all these other different concepts in relation to each other. So the same applies when you have like a social relation. You have to understand that in terms of the other things. And what we have here that Marx breaks down is, in this relation, what ends up happening is, if you break it down to a simplification, is you end up having individuals who end up having private or personal control of particular sets of resources. And through expansion, capital or labor in general gets socialized, such that now it's just not this individual person thing producing for themselves, right? Or individual family producing for themselves. It becomes groups of people producing for groups of people, widespread industrialization, right? Generalized commodity production, right? So through this, the individual relation of ownership did not change. And the relation between the social relation that existed between those doing the labor and the people controlling it constitutes an element of capital. I'm not going to spell in here. Capital. Okay. So you have capital, right, as the dominant owning part of the relation. And this is broke down into capital and labor. And according to Marx, in this alienated state, you have certain, first of all, you have certain psychological phenomena that comes out of this. Particularly, you have the alienation first. Let's go, alienation is going to be small a here. And then you have the reification. And then you have commodity fetishism. And this is important because the alienation is the split. The reification is treating the relationship that exists between us, right? So what I just described was the social relation, right? And when it's in an alienated state, and this is important, why Hegel is important. Because Hegel thinks of him, like I said, if you're thinking of it at the first philosophical metaphysical level, you're thinking of it in terms of the ideas, right? Right. So you could think of it, abstractly. So if you split up these ideas, then you could split up different ways of thinking about it if you don't think about them together, right? So think of that, some people describe that as dialectic, but in general, the Hegelian might be in its totality instead of it as various moments. You're thinking of it in its totality, everything together. So when I describe like production and producing, generally, that's what I describe, right? You have capital and you have labor, working for them, right? An easy way Marx kind of makes this so people can understand it is if you just think of it in terms of slavery, right? So you think of the slaves producing for the slave master as well, right? So the labor is producing everything, but you still have that individualized ownership. through the slave master, right? So in this, you have the same thing. But given that you could alienate these concepts, you could think of capital in and of itself, because it's the dominant relation and because it's a dominant ideological relation. You could think of everything just in terms of still the individual owners, right? So now everything becomes reified, right? Because you could view it in terms of capital, it becomes objectified, and like a switch could happen in between you thinking of just in terms of like the commodities and the money, right? So everything becomes an exchange, and everything becomes a study of the economics of it, right? Of the exchange, right? And that's the era of political economy, according to Marx, because you're ignoring the sociology of it, and you're just discussing the economics. You're ignoring the politics. You're ignoring the social relation, because the underlying social relation is one, of labor and capital. But if you just view it in its one-sidedness, as would be the Hegelian term, into one-sidedness, instead of in its totality, in its two-sided form or multi-sided form, then you can miss the rest. And you could just view it as, if I buy an apple for $5 and I sell it for 10, I made money. Or you could just, view it in terms of, transaction. You could just view it in terms of supply and demand, etc. And that kind of fetishism basically that arises is money, for example, like that the medium of the transactions, like kind of has these what you would consider like special powers, like as a fetish, like a religious fetish object. It becomes a fetishized object because it has special powers, right? Because it manifests its way such that a person could walk in with more money. That doesn't really say anything about the relation. Think of, for example, like, where a rich person goes into, a shop, but they're dressed a certain way and they get treated differently, but they have all this money, but, the visual doesn't connect. But if someone has money, or you don't even see the person because, the money is done through bank digital transactions, right? Then, you get the disconnect where money represents, right? So as soon as they figure out the person has money, it changes their perspective. Like, oh crap, I messed up. I judged this person, but they have this money, and the money, with just the same as the visual tells you something, the money now tells you something, right? It tells you about the social relation, but it's only spoken through the money. The money has the power, right? But the underlying social relation is these people have this ownership property, and that's what's driving their money accumulation and their power, not the actual production of the wealth. And the money's kind of mediating their access to the resources through it, right? And through the slave master and a slave, you understand this as a direct connection, so it's easier to see. But in capital, because of this commodity fetishism, because of the alienation and reification, this easier, right? It's not like you can't alienate the slave from the master. It's not like the alienation can exist there. The reification or the other stuff exists there in different ways. But it's such that it exists in capital because of the dynamics, how dynamic capital is, and how the ideology functions. It creates this situation where the money, you have the money, and it's kind of the fact that you're exploiting the labor, even if it's in the form of slavery, even if it's in the form of feudal relations, even if it's the form of just theft, then that all gets ignored because the money dictates the thought of the social position. Right. So, hope I explained that well enough. Okay. So for Marx, then, because this alienation happened as a socialization of productive forces through labor socialized. I guess I could put S for social. And then this is still privatized, what we call private property, right? Through communism. Right, through the abolition of private property, or through the abolishment of the social relation, what we can get is then a post-capitalist society, which some people like to call the system. That's why I don't like to call it the system, because you have to understand this as the end. This is going to be important when we discuss, when we get into the acid discussions of Afro-pessimism and stuff like that. Like I said, this other stuff is going to get important as the end, right? And then what you have is a post-capitalist society, which you could describe as communistic or socialistic, in the sense that the socialization is no longer denominated by its class structure. So it's no longer by, slavery, by capital, by feudal relations, right? It's dominated now by social interactions in and of themselves. It frees people to be able to have, the authentic social reactions, no longer clouded by, a social relation mediated through, money and private ownership, right? So let me see what else. So this is the socialist. And what Marx argues then is that, given that the production forces are socialized, what it also does is it brings together this socialization and of the wage laborer. So wage labor here now is brought together by this capitalist formation. And now the proletariat, I'm not going to spell out proletariat on here, but proletariat is, the proletariat now is now brought together and becomes a revolutionary force, according to Marx, who can now, through their experience of exploitation of capital and the alienation, could now usurp the capitalists and install a dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay. And that's Marx's view, right? And we'll go over this. Okay. Now, in terms of colonialism, in terms of slavery as developmental factors, you have to think of it in terms of, well, people can think of it in terms of race. Okay. Right. I guess I could add settler colonialism. Parentheses. Right. Okay. And what could happen here is you could have the human. Okay. And this can get divided into, for example, black, white, for example. Right. Now, in the same way, you now have this alienation as you had before, right? These concepts are now split. So it's no longer humans being thought of as humans, if they ever were, or how they are thought of as races before this force happened, before this event happened in history, wherever you want to say, before this happened, before this social change, this revolution happened, you had a specific view of races, of what it meant to have a certain background, what it meant to have a certain, all these different nations and races of groups, right? But due to collision through slavery and colonialism, now you have this divide and alienation. I don't know what to turn this phone off real quick so I don't freaking do this anymore. I usually turn this off before I get started, but do not disturb. There we go. So basically, now you get the same alienation. Black, white. And through this, you can start getting divisions to the concept of human. So already at this level, you have human. But what if you flip it, and now you have a subspecies level, right? The race as subspecies, right? So now you have a different level of humanness depending. So now you have whiteness as human because they're in this alienated state. you divided them so you could start thinking of them differently, right? So we're thinking of white people and black people as different subsets of people. And through this, white becomes human and black becomes non-human, either in a social sense, a biological sense, or a political sense. In this, and what this ends up becoming is white supremacy, right? So now you have, as the human, the white is white supremacy, right? Through this alienation, right? And you have the same reification and fetishism that takes place in the exact same way, right? Where through the process, you can go through it, and certain objectified institutions that exist that are remnants of, this enslavement and this colonization can get read the same way that the relations between labor can get read in terms of, the money and the status, within a capitalist society. So this gets read into the previous description of capital, right? Because if you show up and a particular group of people become the slave, become the worker, become the proletarian of a particular form of capitalism, and are understood through a dynamic of a social relation, through their humanness and their ability to for the legal political system to apply to them in a particular way as regards their labor status, even political economic status specifically, even then you're going to get the situation where that division of white as human then becomes between the black and white as races. And then as time goes on, as it is, institution gets objectified, then even if you try to move back to this status, because the alienation never, the form never got corrected, the social relations underlying never got corrected, where you end up is the same situation as before, but then it gets masked under the concepts of black and white trying to come back and through human, right? And but what I mean by that is, and for just like a concrete example, is you could reinterpret it through criminality, for example, right? So the black person now is no longer a slave, but their sub status underneath this social relation, their subordinate status can get written through as being cultural, right? Or black on black crime, or higher criminality, more propensity to crime. And then you end up getting what you had after slavery, for example, the black codes, and prison labor, and you could get the mass incarceration, you could get the Jim Crow, you can get all of that through this alienation, and through being able to control this social relation, and then mask it through, like I said, even after the end of Jim Crow, then you get mass incarceration, where you're able to mask it through the same way they did after slavery, through criminality, right? So you could treat them a certain way because they're not because of the social relation that you created, but you could treat them a certain way because they're committing crimes, or because they're not following the law, or because they're this or that threat to society, or because they're raping white women, or whatever excuse you can make up over time can still get written into this, right? And this is important because this ends up being how Du Bois and Fanon articulate between the settler and the and notice how this works different, right? Well, actually it works the same, because where you had human and or white supremacy on the top, and you had white and black on the thing, was the same as having capital on the top and capital thing, which the point is the dominant social relation is white supremacy, right? White supremacy becomes the dominant social relation. Okay. And that's very important to understand. And what Du Bois and through concepts, for example, like the Bois' concept on the psychological wage of whiteness, the settler colonial relationship in, Fanon, is this becomes a primary, relationship that for them has, revolutionary potential and force, right? But it's still articulated and expanded the view of Marx because they still accept the fundamentals of how the capitalist relation, the social relation works, but they don't necessarily accept, all the conclusions as far as how they applied it to their situation, right? So I feel that given that Hegel's work was primarily theoretical, I mean, you could get into the stuff like about his history and stuff like that, which becomes non-theoretical. And in that, you could say maybe his understanding of Africa wasn't great, right? But given that Marx's work is not theoretical, for one, it leaves more room for error because there's more where he could add stuff in that's not theoretical. But insofar as his theory is correct, they're able to apply it. Insofar as there's limitations to his theory through incorrect assumptions and observations, they're able to fix that, right? And expand upon the theory. And that becomes a problem with Marx because the relation back to Hegel, the fundamentals, is you need those fundamental tools. But what Marx does is kind of, or what Marxism does, what Engels ends up doing through the historical materialism, through kind of moving away from Hegel and pretending this is a new thing, right? You never get that understanding properly, and you see it, there being an error in Hegel when there is none, right? And you think that they're fixing something through this materialism, which doesn't happen. And so you move away from this fundamentals, and if you don't have those fundamentals, then it's hard to build up on new concepts like they were able to do, because Fanon and Du Bois had those fundamentals, right? And they were able to use those fundamentals to be able to bring new theoretical frameworks to understand how the world operated through colonialism, through slavery, through, white racism, white supremacy, etc. So I'm done with this. Next, what I'm going to bring up is I'm going to bring up just some of the sources. Okay, that's good enough. Okay. So the first thing I'll go back to is Capital. I highlighted a couple of different things in here as far as Marx's view on slavery to show that he didn't necessarily have an incorrect understanding necessarily of slavery. It's just his emphasis on the proletariat, particularly, which at this time was going to be the proletariat of Europe. Changes happened, so you can't be too crazy on him. But I mean, it ended up being wrong. Capitalism ended up evolving probably past where Marx had it without a substantial revolution, particularly in the areas where Marx was kind of suggesting that there would be, right? It's not like exactly he wrote off like Russia, for example, or it's not necessarily that. It's just that he definitely was looking at the proletariat, developed proletariat as a revolutionary force, which never kind of came. And he also didn't necessarily interpret, black revolutionary figures, within the United States, for example, black Americans as a revolutionary force, as Du Bois did, through like Black Reconstruction, for example. Which I'm not going to bring up Black Reconstruction here. I probably should have brought it. I should have brought it in. But I could probably get it. I could probably get it if I need to. So let me see what we got as far as okay. And United States, North America. Okay. Every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed so long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself. In the white skin, where in black is branded. Okay. But out of the death of slavery, a new life once arose. So basically what you're getting here is you're seeing, like, he's not saying, as Du Bois would explicitly say, that through, like, he didn't define, like, there was a dictatorship of the proletariat. He didn't even, like, the idea didn't pop in his head to even say that the, enslaved Africans who freed themselves during the Civil War constituted a dictatorship of the proletariat or a workers' revolution. He didn't like see them as workers, like in that sense, right? He only saw it as like a historical form of development that existed, maybe even within capital. I don't know if you could even attribute that to him, but to be charitable, we'll assume that his theory definitely leaves the room for that. His theory definitely, I mean, obviously, you could come to that conclusion, but whether or not he personally believed that or not, okay. But he definitely did not view them as a revolutionary force in that sense, okay. And for example, here we have and this is how I view things. This might come up later on when I discuss the like the issue with like, for example, when people say like internal colonialism, if that topic comes up, then the United States are, speaking economically, still a colony of Europe. That's how I view it. Which I'm not sure exactly what he meant in that context, but taking it, for what I believe is that, yeah, the United States technically has to be considered internal colonial. That's one problem with the term internal colonialism, for example, because it's viewed as internal when the core is still Britain, European. We speak English for a reason as a colony, right? And just because it's now independent, the only difference between Canada and the United States, for example, it kind of is an independent former colony, right? So I mean, the independent former colony to me, just because the United States was more kind of brash and violent in their exit and in their kind of patriotism, and doesn't negate the fact that they were primarily a British colony and primarily functioned for the longest time for the development of Britain, and then never at any point kind of invaded Britain and kind of started their own, their whole, like the United States military now, NATO and all that other stuff, still operates as a defense structure and mechanism for European power, not, kind of empire that takes over Europe, right? That tries to control Europe through other interests besides just their own, in a sense, right? Like they're not trying to go to Britain and overthrow and install like their own presidency like they do in other parts of the world. They try to have some influence on elections and stuff like that, but if something goes wrong, the likelihood that they invade, since Germany probably, because Germany, they definitely didn't want that to happen. That's a total another discussion, but since the World War II, World War I and World War II, which was British German type conflict, that it's not going to happen. So unless Germany comes up again as a communist nation, and Britain and the United States has to go invade again, even all of Europe is probably safe from this. Western Europe, obviously, because obviously Ukraine wasn't safe, and parts of Russia definitely weren't. So okay, so okay, but with this too grows the revolt of the working class, right? He's talking about the development of capitalism. But with this too grows the revolt of the working class. The class always increased in numbers and discipline, united, organized by the very mechanism. See how you see the language he's using, right? Disciplined. See, when I use the term discipline today, I use labor discipline to describe how capital keeps control of labor, right? How they invent mechanisms to be able to keep labor, unstable and unable to revolt or organize. United, organized by the very mechanism process of capitalist production itself. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production. See, it's a fetter upon the mode of production. He's in terms of in itself, right? Not just through the process. He's viewing this like a smooth process. Like slavery was a fetter on the capital, or feudalism was. So feudalism we got rid of feudalism, and we got rid of slave relations, and now we're going to get rid of capital in the same way, like smoothly, which didn't happen, right? And people like try to use that excuse, like, oh well, capitalism existed for, or I mean, this relation existed for all these years until capitalism, but that below, when I get to what I get to below, and then that'll make more sense. So let me just finish this. Um, Let me see. Centralization of the means of production, socialization of labor. That's what I was talking about earlier, right? All of this is what I was talking about earlier when I described my little like kind of breakdown. So basically, can flourish under it. Centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor. That's what I was talking about. Where labor got socialized and capital can maintain the private control, where they become incompatible with the capitalist. And basically the know of capitalism, private property sounds. Okay, the transformation of scattered private property. Okay, yeah. Okay, the capitalist mode of appropriation, the result of the capitalist mode of production produces capitalist private property. That's what I just mentioned. And if the first negation, and see, this is where he's using Hegelian language against, but I didn't discuss this. But negation can be another terminology that describes these certain alienations, these splits, negation, and you have negation of negation, and you have the Aufheben or the sublation and lifting up. I'll discuss that. I'll discuss that now, basically. So yeah, I forgot to mention that earlier. But when I was making that chart, I forgot to add in the terms negation. Obviously, that the negation can create the split, the alienation, and then we have the negation of the negation. When you negate it back, then you have the Aufheben potentially, and the bringing of something that still has all these as moment elements, but increases it to something else, right? It means to lift up, right? But at the same time abolish and hold on to, right? Okay. So what you're lifting up is the socialization of the production forces. What you're abolishing is the capitalist ownership, and what you're holding on to is the production, right? The socialized production, which is kind of the same thing as I said before, but the production force, the dynamism, the wealth creation, right, aspects, right? And this does not reestablish private property for the producer, but gives him individual property-based acquisitions in a capitalist era. And then the transformation of scattered private property arising from individual labor into capitalist private property is natural, a process incomparable, is more protracted, violent, and difficult transformation of capitalist property. So basically saying, it's more than practically resting on socialized production into socialized property. In the former case, basically describing is how the when socialism, basically as he puts right here, usurpers by the masses of people. Basically, when the masses of people rise up and take over, the society and socialize the property, what ends up happening is going to be kind of simpler than the process that it took to accumulate capital in the first place, basically. So I'm pretty sure that's it here. Yeah. And I think these are his chapters on accumulation. Yeah. History or tendency of capitalist accumulation, basically. Yeah. So I do not need to save a copy. Okay. So this is one of the discussions of Proudhon. This is the one where I was saying, where he kind of makes fun of him for using a Hegelian language, but then in Capital you saw him using the Hegelian, like the entire Hegelian architecture, if you will. But yeah, and he uses the religious stuff too, the fetishism and stuff like that. It's basically describing capitalism, basically to function as a religion, right? But anyway, this is very important to the like the colonial spin that's placed on the show that was already there in Marx, but Marx through his Eurocentrism, if you will, was unable to see these aspects, right? Because he was centering himself in his analysis as a proletarian or he was really like bourgeois, but in a sense, as a proletarian, thinker of sorts within the paradigm that existed, within Europe where he lived in, uh, Western Europe. So this is he was responding to Proudhon's antagonism of freedom and slavery. He talks about what he's talking about. Direct, like the blacks in Brazil and in the southern U.S. Right. So direct slavery is as much the pivot upon which our present day industrialism turns as our machinery, credit, etc. Without slavery, there would be no cotton. Without cotton, there would be no modern industry. It is slavery which has given value to the colonies. It is the colonies which have created the world trade, and the world trade is a necessary condition for large-scale machine industry. Consequently, prior to the slave trade, the colonies sent very few products to the old world and did not noticeably change the face of the world. Slavery is therefore an economic category of paramount importance. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive nation, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. Only wipe North America off the map and you will get anarchy, the complete decay in trade and modern civilization. But to do away with slavery would be to wipe America off the map. Being an economic category, slavery has existed in all nations since the beginning of the world, which, this is a problem I usually have with people when they say, slavery as it existed in the United States was fundamental, and how it existed throughout at this time was completely different than how slavery existed, elsewhere in the world. And this was kind of documented in one of the works that I'm going to reference, but I'm not going to reference that specific part of the work, but because that's kind of a different topic. But yeah, when people analyze slavery like really seriously and the changes that happened, this form of slavery that we had was completely, race based, slavery that set a political identity for for eternity. Basically, it's kind of something that's completely, unique in a sense. So okay, get in the map. I guess in all nations since the beginning of the world, all the modern nations have achieved is the disguise slavery at home and import it openly into the new world. After these reflections on slavery, what will the good? Okay, yeah. So that's basically it. Okay, so yeah, basically he's saying how slavery was basically the catalyst for capitalism, and colonialism was the catalyst for capitalism. So moving on. Okay. So first, what do I want to look at first? Okay, first I'll look at the work. Okay, this is the law of freedom and bondage. You could look through this work. You can get it, law of freedom and bondage. You can get it off like archive.com. I think it's John Hurd or something like that, HURD or something like that. But yeah. Okay, this is this is gonna be kind of quick. Basically, what I want to show is kind of how the relation was defined in terms of slavery, right? Okay, because when they took over the colonies, a change happened, particularly with the English. This fundamental to understanding like the history and what and how that social relations changed, right? Prior, it was the case that if like with the Spanish and everybody else, black people were being used as slaves, but if you converted to Christianity, that was the paradigm, right? It was Christian and non-Christian, civilized and non-civilized had to do with religious and Christian views, right? So if you became part of the civilized world through Christianity, the differences, although there was still racial sentiment that was just like common racism, like Christianity kind of stood as a means of kind of elevating you to a status that was similar to, or could at least approach the social status of basically those particular type of colonization, you could become under the law, right? And in a sense, for through a lineage aspect, right? Nationality in terms of race, nationality as race, and religion as race went together, such that if you were French, right? So if you had a French father or an English father, you could be considered French and English, and you could have the aspect of being a Christian and French or English, right? This was erased politically and legally, defining this through the alienation of color first. This got defined, right? And this is a result, right? Where you have, whereas some doubts have arisen. Let me make sure this is big enough. I'll just build it real quick, right? 100%. I'll make it 200. Okay. Whereas some doubts have arisen, right? Whether children got by an Englishman, what I just mentioned, upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it that all children born in this country, this is 1662, shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. By C13, women servants whose common employment is working on the ground are made to the board. That's just the addition to it. Okay. That conferring of baptism doth not alter. This is 67, a couple years later. Doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. So the status is no longer connected to this paternal lineage. So any sexual assault, rape of slave women, or any legitimate relationship did not mean freedom. It also, any conversion to Christianity, so the slaves could be related to the master, could be the same religious views as the master, and the condition stay the same. This is very important for understanding the development of white supremacy and racism, because this change thinks this is the 1600s, right? So this is completely different, or somewhat, different than how this was handled throughout other colonies. So this is a very big deal for how the United States, this is Virginia being, sort of a main colony, always, still, Virginia is still a core, part of, they made the capital in DC, but Virginia is still sort of like, a core aspect of, the United States. And, yeah, they made these laws, so that lineage was now rooted in slavery and now rooted in a particular political dynamic, a social relation of race, which is very important to understand that social relation. If you don't understand this, it's hard to understand, moving forward, how this social relation is ingrained even through Du Bois's work, through the color cast, or through segregation and Reconstruction, or how it's viewed today, it's in terms of mass incarceration, or how was viewed in Fanon in terms of colonization, colonialism, right? Okay, without saving. So this is Fanon real quick. This should be pretty quick. I'm not even probably going to read this. But concerning violence, basically, here what Fanon describes, basically. Wait, 200 is too big on this one. Okay. So basically what Fanon is describing is how decolonization sets out to change the order of the world. Okay. And how it's inherently violent. the settler has brought the native into existence and perpetuates his existence, right? The settler owes the fact of his very existence, that is to say, his property, to the colonial system. What has to be understood, the dynamic that can be expressed here, and this expressed through, or can be interpreted through Fanon's work, is that the relationship between colonization, slavery particularly, is primary and has primacy in the sense of opposition to the system as such. There is a relation, a social relation that doesn't exist between the European worker and the system at a fundamental level. Right. Because the Aufheben, the abolishing of this relationship of the system, wouldn't in the same way be a simple shift. It'd be something that's totally fundamental, right? The abolishing of capital is something fundamental between the worker and the capital, but not necessarily between the entire social structure of white supremacy that brought capital into being in the first place, right? So as what Marx mentioned, he was honest, and he mentioned what the root of this wealth in the system, what the root of the wealth in the system was, what brought this system into being, and that's why I said I relate back later to why I said it was like going to be fundamentally important that the system was brought into being, right, by slavery and colonialism, right? So if it's brought into being by colonial, is in how in is how you go out, blood in, blood out. The shift, the paradigm in which the system lies through this interpretation could be seen as through colonialism and slavery, not as through the developmental forces of capitalism. The part I'm thinking of is when I said where people say it took that long to develop. No, from the impetus, from the 500 or however many years ago, when colonialism started taking off, this was very quick revolutionary. It was very quick progression of capitalism. It wasn't a long protract. It was long and protracted in a sense, but it also wasn't long and protracted really at all, right? As soon as you had 1600s, you have like the 1600 development. I mean, there's wars being fought. You have the English, civil wars being fought. You have the French Revolution. You have the American Revolution. You have the American Civil War. You have World War One. You have World War Two. You have the Russian Revolution. And you have all these proxy wars, the Cold War, that are fought. I guess some of that doesn't constitute, because I guess we got to split those up into two, right? So you have the Cold War and the Russian, Chinese revolutions and stuff that are communistic, that happen outside of the core. They're outside the core, and in particular instances, none of them are successful at overthrowing capital as a dominant relation in the world. None of them. In the countries, you could have arguments. You say, "Oh, China's capitalist, Russia was, wasn't technically real." So you could have all these type of arguments. That doesn't even matter, because even if it was in that country, it wasn't in the core. It wasn't in the entire world. Capitalism remained a dominant relation in the entire world. Soviet Union collapsed because of that. Other countries didn't even manage to get to, any type of, progression, because of that. Cuba, for example, totally stifled in their ability to be able to do anything because all these sanctions, all these, embargoes and blocks and everything on their whole being. The countries in Africa getting dictators. I mean, not dictators, but getting some dictators installed in South America, getting dictators installed and getting their presidents assassinated, right? Because the capital is still the dominant relation in the world, and these small little third world formations weren't able to hold up to it. And in the actual core, despite all of these imperialist, capitalist wars, like I mentioned, the English, the French, the Civil War. So we're talking about the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, 1900s was the World War I, World War II. Again, imperialist wars. And even though we saw some, like I said, third world or secondary formations, none of the core collapsed. But in the core, countries and colonies, not the core. Well, I guess the core, but not the European, the European mother countries, but in the colonies, like for example in America, it's still a core country now because of its economic development. But within its growing economic development in the South, you had slave revolts, so you had more of a revolting, more revolutions, and more holds being taken place, potentially by those farthest away. And this is a point when I get to my points, farthest away from the proximity to capital, in the sense both of physical location, spatially, but also spatially in terms of their ideological viewpoints, right? You can't, there's no ideology without like completely disrupting the understanding of the relationship that exists, fundamentally, without, kind of brainwashing a person completely out of their identity that could exist through the settler and the colonist, through, slaves and masters. That direct relationship where that social relation doesn't get, it's hard to cover that up, right? You have to assimilate otherwise, right? So without the assimilation into whiteness of these groups, that's a fundamental disagreement. That's fundamental contradiction that doesn't necessarily have to exist, as long as white supremacy can bring an assimilation of these other groups a lot easier through an identity itself, right? Even all the identities that we'll discuss when we discuss identity politics, identities through Black nationalism, etc., or identities that are in direct relationship to the system and define themselves directly relation. That's why it's controlled opposition, right? But the controlled opposition in terms of, the white groups, the opposition part aspect of it becomes kind of clouded in the sense that the fundamentals are not opposed, but just certain formations or of the fundamental system is opposed abstractly, even, right? And that's very important, how that operates, how white supremacy can actually take primacy over capital through this, right? That's the fundamental understanding. Okay. So the next work, and this just so we can get quickly, I mean, it's not going to be very quick. This is going to be a long video. So yeah, definitely, I didn't think I was going to explain this much. But yeah, this is definitely going to have to be broken into 2 videos now. So, okay, this is going to be describing the development of the consciousness, and where I mentioned the Hegelian aspect of it, the split of consciousness, and how Fanon articulates the alienation of Black from white, from the human perspective. And obviously we know his view on colonialism. But okay. He talks about objecthood, and he talks about as long as the Black man is amongst his own, he will have no occasion to experience his being through others. And he talks about being through others in Hegel. But then he talks about colonized uh, uh, ontology is made unattainable in a colonized and civilized society. It seemed that this wasn't given sufficient attention, but it outlaws ontological explanation. Okay, conceals the basic problem, right? It says ontology, once it finally admitted as leaving existence by the wayside, does not permit us to understand the being of black man. For the black man must uh for 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 not only must the black man be black, he must be black in relation to a white man, right? Like I was describing earlier, right? The white supremacy has the primacy, though, is this point, right? The white supremacy has a primacy, and the definitions only in relation to the white man through that premise, that primary cause of the alienation, through that primary aspect of the state. Another way to put it, in Lacanian terms, because Lacan comes up with a lot of, if you think about symbolic orders and symbolic chains and signifying chains and chains of signifiers, that's how you could think of those chains that I made earlier as chains of signifiers. And what you have through those chains of signifiers is a master signifier, in a sense, one that permeates throughout in such a way that is fundamental to the conception, right? And what he's saying is that ontologically, when you strip that away outside of its essential metaphysical essence, right, out of its like metaphysical interpretation, out of its relationship, right, there's nothing there, because the black is not the master signifier in this relation. It says some critics will take on themselves to remind us that the proposition has a converse. That's what he means by that is that you can define in terms of white, which in a metaphysical sense is true, but in an ontological sense it is not, because it's not the master primary force behind the split. White supremacy would have to be abolished. You can't, in a sense, abolish blackness, right? You have to abolish blackness. You have to abolish white supremacy. In that sense, it says, I say this as false, right? And this is one of his more famous quotes: "The black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. Overnight, the Negro has been given two frames of reference within which he has to place himself: his metaphysics, as I just mentioned, less pretentiously his customs and the sources on which these were based." That's what I described when I described that, like the change in colonialization, what evolved from that, right? What evolved from the defining of that status as colonized, as enslaved, right? Customs on which they were based. Okay, he has no place to start. His metaphysics, that's pretty, his customs and sources on which they were based. Okay. What he's referring to is on which they were based prior to that. So at that point, when I was broken apart, obviously something new came, right? But that came within the context of white supremacy. What was before that were wiped out because they were in conflict with the civilization that he did not know, and they imposed himself on it, right? See what I mean? The white supremacy imposed the relation, got rid of the old, and now something new has to come, right? And there's another video that I was going to show of Zizek explaining this in relation to Malcolm X, which, I mean, Zizek doesn't really know U.S. history, so maybe kind of like that, but his, like, symbolically what he said still stands, even if it's kind of like maybe missing the point, which I'll show that in a minute, or I might edit it in. But I'll either show it after I go through this, or I'll edit it in. By way of conclusion, okay, and through and this he goes in, like, you know, should I you know, kind of through the ideas of should he tried to do certain things like in terms of with the identity stuff. That'll become relevant when I discuss the identity stuff, but it's not really relevant now. Okay. It says, um, okay, this is afterwards, but it says the Negro is not any more than the white man, right? It says that tool never possessed a man. The enslavement of man by man ceased forever. That is, of one by another. That it be possible for me to discover and to love man wherever he may be. Both must turn their backs on the inhuman voices which were those of the respective ancestors in order that an authentic communication be possible. And he doesn't mean like idiotically here, like people argue like I'm not like we're not black, we're American, not in the sense that like black American, but in the sense that like kind of like in the Candace Owens type reactionary conservative sense of, oh no, we're not, there's no black people aren't held back, racism doesn't exist, we should just pretend we should just be post-racial in a post-racial sense. I mean, he doesn't mean in the post-racial sense, right? Because I mean, obviously, come on, it's Fanon, so you obviously colonization is a violent process. He doesn't mean it in that sense, but you understand where he's coming from. And basically he says, one duty alone, that of renouncing my freedom through choices. Okay, so I should constantly remind myself that the leap consists in introducing invention into existence. Basically, what he's describing here, like I said, is that black and white are split into this alienated processes, and through that, the human relation needs to be re-realized, and through invention, he means through their own actions of recapturing that humanity, not through a lens of the past through reactionary means, but through revolutionary action and invention in the sense of asserting yourself, right? That's why he says, there is no Negro mission, there is no white burden. I find myself suddenly in a world in which things do evil, a world in which I am summoned into battle, a world in which it is always a question of annihilation or triumph. I find myself, I, a man, in a world where words wrap themselves in silence, in a world where the other endlessly hardens himself. No, I do not have the right to go out and cry out my hatred at the white man. I do not have a duty to murmur my gratitude to the white man. My life is caught in a lasso of existence. My freedom turns me back on myself. No, I do not have the right to be a Negro. I do not have the duty to be this or that. If the white man challenges my humanity, I will impose my whole weight as a man on his life and show that I am not the show good eating that he persists in imagining, right? It says, I find myself suddenly in the world and I recognize that I have one right alone, that is demanding human behavior from the other. Right? Okay. And we're going to see, and this is very important, the intelligence of individuals, like I said, when they have that fundamental basis, because obviously in that work, I didn't point this out, but Fanon specifically discusses Hegel in relation to this. So he's read Hegel, he studied Marx, he's studied the French, because he's French, thinkers and stuff like that. And obviously, you have Du Bois, who's really real educated at Harvard. He went back to Berlin, so he studied at least some Hegel. He's more Kantian in the sense that I don't think he makes any. He doesn't. I don't think he ever mentions Hegel. He mentions Kant. He doesn't. I don't think he ever mentions Hegel. But you could tell he was influenced by it. You could tell he had an understanding. Basically, he was very intelligent. But you can see this is where he comes up with the second sight, which is basically the same thing that Fanon basically was talking about. Same theory, right? They came to the same conclusion, which is impressive usually when thinkers are able to come to the same conclusion like that without even familiarity. And this is before before Freud even, I think. I mean, well, after Freud, like they're alive at the same time. So, but this is before a lot of Freud's major works. This is way before Lacan. So this is a pretty significant development to show up in his work like this. You know, this is a very early articulation of this idea, which shows his intelligence and his theorizing capabilities. But it says, sort of a seventh son born with a veil and gifted with a second sight in this American world, which world him no true self-consciousness, right? Remember how I said the splitting of self-consciousness, but only lets him see through a revelation of the other world in a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of the other. That's what he's basically describing the same thing as Fanon. I was describing that Fanon described, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world. He's describing it more poetically though, because Fanon's writing is kind of straight. Like I don't think he cares. The Bois is really like literary. Like he has a really like literary edge and always wants to like use colorful language and you know, where Fanon is kind of like just straightforward, just to say it. I mean, like he was just going straight through. And in comparison, like Marx and Hegel, like they all have different writing styles. It's hilarious. Because like Hegel's writing style is actually really nice though. If you actually don't read the philosophy parts of it and read like other like the introductions and remarks and stuff, but Marx tries to be like maybe a little bit too pretentious sometimes. The Bois is kind of like a straight line, but literary. It says it's peculiar sensation of double conscious sense to always look at self. Okay, there's one of the soul tape of looks on and amused contempt and pity whenever it feels a two-ness. And this is very important too. This is gonna become probably another topic. But an American and a Negro, right? As black and American, that's the split, the alienation that exists. From the American perspective, obviously. Two souls, two thoughts, two reconciled strivings, two warring ideals, and one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. This is very important because this is what I'll show the video with Zizek, and what you're going to get is both Du Bois and Fanon have this this expectation and this grounding in this notion of not a reactionary sense of just doing away with colonialization through just decolonialization and revolution, but through creating like the Aufheben, right? You have one part it gets held on to, one part gets abolished, and then it gets risen up to something new, right? So it gets risen up to this new human. People might call it like humanism or whatever, universality. I don't really care, right? But you have this greater universal of human freedom that now exists, but the blackness that exists can never be just done away with, right? You can never get away with that trauma that's there that can't be erased, but you can raise it up to this newness, right? And it still holds on to the universal aspects and the history of struggle that exists within that context of colonization, that still had the aspects of the European history, maybe even that can't be like just ripped away from you, right? You went to you grew up under the system of white supremacy. You went to these European institutions. You grew up under capitalism. You grew up learning Marx and Hegel, and even the black thinkers that they read Marx and Hegel. They read Fanon and Du Bois, right? So you grew up in this lineage, intellectual lineage. You speak English, right? You can't erase that from your being, right? So it's raising up to this new level, right? But there's these tensions that exist because the aspects within those are in conflict, in the sense that America is striving towards this liberal dominance of white supremacy, right? You know what I mean? But then you have this other aspect of you that's striving against it, right? But they're together at the same time inherently, and the resolving of that conflict, basically the negation of the negation, and the abolishing of this white supremacy to bring it up to a new to a new aspect, which he doesn't really necessarily get to that far in it, but he recognizes. Well, I mean, it's inherent in what he's saying, basically. Yeah, and he does get to that. Yeah, he does get to that conclusion. He does get to that conclusion. Which he simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. And obviously, Du Bois after this point goes on to be when he does Black Reconstruction and discussion of Marx and stuff like that. Which I could bring up that now, and I'll show the Zizek video, and I think that's it. I'm going to split I had to split this up into the other separate video, but this is the articulation of Du Bois. Obviously, in Black Reconstruction, I'm just going to show it. Black Reconstruction, right? So in this, he re-envisions the Civil War as a proletarian revolution through the lens of Black slaves in a revolt, freeing themselves, and he considers the black proletariat. And one of the chapters is funny because let me see, what is it, 381. Okay, yeah. I first called this chapter I don't know if people's gonna be able to see this. I'm gonna blow it up real quick. Okay. So I first called this chapter the dictatorship of the black proletariat in South Carolina. See, right? His initial thought, right? It says, but it had been brought to my attention that this would not be the correct, since universal suffrage does not lead to real dictatorship until workers use their voices consciously to rid themselves of the domination of private capital, right? But, right, you can see his lens of viewing it through the black proletariat and through the lens of a dictatorship of the proletariat, of them taking power in the South during Reconstruction, sort of, right? But then he probably talked to a white Marxist, like, oh no, you can't say that. But I don't know who he talked to, but it said it was brought to my attention, but I don't think he necessarily says who he talked to. But I always thought that was really funny. But the fact that he saw that and he was able to articulate this way shows his intellectual genius. And this was like, right after he was, kind of try to introducing people to Marx. And I don't know exactly when he read Marx, but I mean, the way he incorporated the analysis was, it was wonderful. And let me show this last table of contents. Oh yeah, I was going to show this earlier. Along with the Lacanian, splitting up of the way things are viewed, you could also view it through like the Hegel's way. Where's this at? Oh yeah. So Hegel, I definitely got to blow that up. Hegel breaks it down in the being essence. That's what I was going to say. When he describes the ontological, he is being in Hegel, and essential metaphysical is essence, and then the logic is in the notion, right? So being, indeterminate being, right, is like the world imagined with no like kind of with no determinateness, right? It's indeterminate, right? So nothing's separated yet. And then through the innate categories of the human mind, you get qualities, right? So people see shapes, textures, colors. They could differentiate objects through their vision and through their touch, through the senses. And then quantity, they could quantize and break apart numerically, and then measure. They could, they could kind of take those things together and then get whole, like a whole, right? So you take the quantity and the qualities and put them together. The qualities and the quantities and put them together, and then that leads you into the essence, where you could then add to the reflection and an appearance and actuality, which I don't like the reflection appearance. Maybe I'd say like and its potentiality, and then its reality or existence and actuality or something like that. But I guess that's good enough, right? Actuality is reflection, and the Kanian way might be a little bit easier for people. Is he uses the terms imaginary and symbolic, and if you appropriate these terms to these categories, then imaginary becomes a being, right? It's the images you get, right? Is the being, right? And then the essence is the symbolic added into the being, right? Added into the being, you have the symbolic framework, which you're able to connect to the images, which creates your reality. And then your analysis of the reality as such incorporates both the essence and the being, right? The subjectivity and objectivity kind of back and forth for the idea within the notion, right? Right. So that's how he breaks that down. And like I said, the Khan breaks it down like that. And then yes, another way, obviously, he does being and then being, nothing, becoming. He always breaks down these tripartite type things. Unity of being and nothing, moments of becoming, sublation of becoming, determinate, finitude. So yeah, determinate being. He starts with indeterminate being, and then it becomes determinateness, and then determinate being for self, and then quantity, magnitude, and then their relationship, right? So it's pretty much the same. And they just break it down into like bigger categories. And then it gets to the absolute idea objective, which is basically logic, which people could also describe, like I said, as ontology, metaphysics in that sense, essential. I don't know what the word would be, but essential. The essential is sort of a type of metaphysics, and then logic. And another thing that I had that I want to point out while I'm here is the fact that white supremacy recognized like an aspect of what I'm going to talk about, and this is going to be the next video by now because I took up so much time, but recognize the aspect of the revolutionary potential of slavery and black people in general towards their system, right? Because as Du Bois discussed in Suppression of the Slave Trade, what they're trying to suppress isn't slavery in the sense that they need to end slavery because slavery is this inhuman, like, kind of like this terrible, system that is immoral and gross. That plays a part, but more of the part is they needed to just get rid of or do away with the amount of black people because that posed a serious threat to their power and to their systems and to their ownership if they decided to revolt, which was, I mean, they understood the revolutionary potential, right? And that'll be discussed in the next video a little bit. But it said, here's their dispositions, basically. So the first disposition, which didn't last very long, and I discussed this, you'll get the reference. That after conversion to Christianity, that they could be in the same position and basically be subjects of the British king, and this disappeared early in colonial history, which I just went over. And the next one is the slave trade stopped, right? Because they ended the slave trade, but they didn't end the slave trade. It just went on. It just became illegal human trafficking and human breeding and selling. Therefore, attack upon slavery must begin with the abolition of the slave trade, and after that, the race problem would settle itself, right? So you basically just get rid of the slave trade, so you start bringing them in, and then eventually it'll kind of work out because you just start bringing them in, and they could just kind of die out and assimilate on their own in lower numbers, hopefully, right? And it said if they did not die out, obviously, if that didn't work, then by gradual emancipation and economic failure of slavery, they became free. They must systematically deported out of the country, right? So they had to just get rid of them, right? That's where the immigration and colonization society and stuff began, right? And then hopefully they just will send them back somewhere. We'll just ship them off. We'll just try to get them away from here, so we don't have to deal with the problem. And then people die of laziness and disease, which happen in some instances. and then represented attitude from the end of 1812 and down to the beginning of the Cotton Kingdom. And then after, they started, capitalism started exploding and making all this money off of, cotton, then that kind of threw like a slight wrench in that idea, which not really. I mean, they still kind of brought up this idea of this separatism is a constant trend. And it said then the new one was to be perpetual slaves in a new economy, which recognized a caste of slave workers, and this caste system might eventually displace the white worker. At any rate, it was destined to a wider expansion towards the tropics. This was the attitude of the Confederacy, right? That then what you had was this happened, right? So as you could see here, from here until roughly here, the numbers are pretty stabilized by 1%. And then during the Cotton Kingdom, though, it's not really gone yet. But after the civil, but I mean, as the progression goes on, you can see that the total percentage of the population of the black population goes down. So for a minute, it's stabilized. But as you can see, the Confederacy kind of lost that because it just goes down, 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 down. So it basically went from lower. I mean, it primarily went down because they were lower in the colonies first. I mean, the upper colonies. And then it was just getting concentrated in the South, right? And then after slavery ended, like, obviously it didn't end. It continued through convict leasing, through peonage, through sharecropping, through prison. Oh yeah, I said that, convict leasing, but yeah, through those various practices, tenant farming and stuff like that. And then after that, you see the numbers drop, and then they start stabilizing again once you have like the baby boom, and then you have to start having immigration from other African countries. But it dropped from 20% to below 10%, and this was a deliberate effort. And what this doesn't incorporate is genocide, which is a different discussion, and which could be seen through all of the slave, what do you call it, race riots. But in general, it wasn't race riots. They just went in, like, we're just massacring black people. And then also you had the race riots plus just like mass incarceration and all these other like deadly. And then you had like the health disparities, and you had eugenics, and you had Jim Crow, and then mass incarceration, and then the environmental stuff, the economic attacks, right? All of that. But what else we got? Here's just a chart of that. But as you can see also, there was a deliberate effort on the flip side of understanding to bring in white workers as a replacement. So the what then happened was you had a huge increase from the 1860s up until the 1930s, Great Depression and New Deal era, of immigration brought in to be the laboring power. And this is key. If you watch my video on the class analysis, you will see how that's key, because after which, and obviously you see the migrant, this is from Mexico, the migrant labor becomes a new principle. And you start getting all these like from immigration from Mexico. But which, I mean, you already had, but in addition, you start getting a little bit more. That starts being a dominant, because they stop bringing over massive amounts of Europeans after they fully industrialized the second industrial revolution and stuff like that. But like this group today, these group of who are these people? Germans, mainly Germany, Russia, Italy. These are all people who integrated and assimilated into white supremacy, right? That's the importance of that as a primary, aspect of the relation within capital, right? Those things have to go together. It's not capitalism is driving this, but within this relation, this white supremacy exists as capital. The capitalism is a structure of white supremacy, right? It's how white supremacy initiated in the first place, was through colonization and slavery, and the development of capitalism, which allowed them to expand the wealth even more dynamically, right? And then I gotta go to the library. Should have, yeah.
Oh, he's one of my heroes, Malcolm X, the great American, a little bit more violent than Martin Luther King, fighter for black rights. You know why he has chosen this no family name, but just X? X, unknown quantity, instead of, I don't know what, family name. Of course, at an immediate level, he wanted to emphasize how the blacks, by being torn out of their African ancestral homes, that they are deprived of their roots. But the program of Malcolm X was not, so let's return to those roots. But X means, what if we grasp this very void into which our enslavement put us? The fact that we don't have any genuine tradition to rely on, that we have to, as it were, collectively reinvent our identity as a unique opportunity of freedom. And it's also clear that he followed this line. At the end, we may debate it if he was right. He found the new universalist frame in Islam. He became Muslim. So he had no dreams about returning to origins.